It was just after 5:15 on the afternoon of the 24th of May 1996 when Bruce Herrod arrived at the summit of Mt Everest. It had been a long day, and that's putting it mildly, but through perseverance, determination, and sheer force of will, he was, at that moment in time, the highest human being on the planet. His jubilation is clear to see in his self-portrait. An accomplished photographer, Bruce not only captured his moment of triumph, but he did it with a professional's eye. Great composition, crisp focus, perfect exposure. It's a wonderful photograph, but, tragically, it was to be the last photograph that Bruce Herrod would ever take. Bruce Herrod was a man of many talents. He had a doctorate in geophysics from Cambridge University. He'd spent 7 years working for the British Antarctic Survey, honing his photography skills, taking pictures in the harsh polar conditions of the southern ice cap. He had written an excellent photo book on the peaks of Snowdonia, and he was an accomplished trekker, explorer and mountaineer. He was described by his partner Sue Thompson as considerate, thoughtful and charming, but with a wicked sense of humour. When it came to mountaineering, Herrod was described as cautious, not one prone to take wild risks. Indeed, Thompson says that Herrod would often think things through in almost tedious detail. He was physically strong, experienced in harsh climates, and he had a mature and rational outlook. In short, if anybody was going to go to Everest and come back alive, it would surely be a guy like Bruce Herrod. Herrod had always nurtured a desire to visit Everest, and his chance to climb the mountain came in 1995 when he met mountaineer Ian Woodall at a travel exhibition in London. Woodall was putting together a team to make the first South African attempt on Everest, and he needed a professional photographer for the trip. Would Bruce be interested? Herrod apparently accepted the job on the spot. Now, the South African team was garnering its own publicity, as it was to be the first team from post-apartheid South Africa to attempt Everest, and it was also the first South African mountaineering team to include both black and white members. The prestigious British newspaper The Sunday Times was sponsoring the climb, and Nelson Mandela was personally giving his support. For Bruce Herrod, it was the chance to be part of something historic, as well as fulfilling his own personal ambition to have a crack at the summit of Everest. The South African team arrived at Everest Base Camp in April of 1996, but tensions within the team were already rising, apparently due to Ian Woodall's autocratic style of leadership. Woodall seems to be a difficult character to get a sense of. On the one hand, he was undoubtedly a divisive team leader, often yelling, shouting and swearing, and he regularly butted heads with other expedition leaders. He apparently threatened to kill one of the Sunday Times editors who had flown out to Everest Base Camp to see him. Woodall has also been cast squarely in the role of the selfish villain for apparently refusing to share his radio kit during the disaster which occurred on May the 10th, when 8 climbers died during a terrible storm. On the other hand, some of Woodall's later actions seem to completely contradict these assertions that he was a driven but purely selfish man. He remains, to me at any rate, a bit of an enigma. Anyhow, by the time the South African team had gotten themselves established at base camp, they were already falling apart. The top 3 climbers and the team doctor all quit, leaving behind a much reduced team comprising of expedition leader Ian Woodall, climbers Cathy O'Dowd and Dacian Daisel, and climber and team photographer Bruce Herrod. The team continued to be mired in controversy as it became known that Woodall and O'Dowd had become romantically involved during the expedition, and that Dacian Daisel's name didn't even appear on the team's climbing permit, meaning that legally she had no chance of getting to the summit at all on this trip, and really she shouldn't have even been on the mountain in the first place. Accusations of favouritism and political window dressing abounded. Then, the Sunday Times withdrew its support for the climb, leaving a serious hole in the funding and logistics for a summit attempt. However, throughout all this negative publicity, it seems that Bruce Herrod just kept his head down, managed to avoid becoming embroiled in the politics of the expedition, and he got on with his job. By now, the group was so small that Herrod was definitely going to be included in the summit attempt. And so, the smaller team, consisting of Ian Woodall, Cathy O'Dowd, Bruce Herrod and 3 Sherpas, climbed to the South Col on the 9th of May, planning for a summit attempt on the 10th. In the event, the South African team was not ready to set off as planned, and instead they remained in their camp on the South Col. Meanwhile, one of the most infamous days in Everest's history was being played out on the upper ridges above them. As large numbers of guides, Sherpas and clients became bottlenecked on the summit ridge, waiting in line for their turn to touch the peak, inconvenience and impatience turned to tragedy as a terrible storm hit the mountain. Now, I'm not going to go into details here about what happened, but to cut a long story short, after a chaotic and tragic night on the mountain, 8 climbers were dead, and amongst them were expedition leaders Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there were accusations of cowardice and neglect, counter-accusations of lying and scapegoating. The Everest climbing community was in a state of shock and disbelief. Herrod himself was apparently deeply upset by what he'd witnessed, and as a South African team descended from the South Col and returned to base camp, standing on the summit of Everest must have seemed a very remote prospect indeed. However, the team decided to make one more attempt, and it would be the very last one of the season, scheduled for May 24th. Bruce Herrod's partner Sue Thompson, who was in London but had been in constant touch with him during the disastrous events of the previous few days, was shocked and surprised when Bruce announced that he was going to try again for the summit. She'd assumed that after everything that had happened and how it had affected him, that Bruce would be coming home in the next available flight. But it was not to be. Bruce Herrod had set his sights on the summit, and he was determined to make it to the top. The final attempt was made on May 24th as planned. Around midnight, Ian Woodhall, Cathy O'Dowd, Pemba Sherpa and Bruce Herrod set off from the camp on the South Col, climbing in darkness to ensure that they had plenty of time to reach the summit and get back in daylight. Now, from the outset, Bruce seems to have had trouble finding his rhythm, stopping constantly to readjust his overboots and gradually falling behind the other climbers. Pemba Sherpa, Woodhall and O'Dowd all reached the summit at around 9:50 in the morning. They celebrated their achievement and left mementos on the summit. After spending around 15 minutes on the top of the world, they began the long descent back to the South Col. Seeing no sign of Bruce, they assumed that he must have already turned back, but to their astonishment, as they were descending along the southeast ridge close to the south summit, they unexpectedly ran into Herrod, who was still pushing on, grinding his way slowly upwards. By now it's around 12:30 p.m, in reality much too late for Herrod to reach the summit and get back down safely before darkness fell. However, the ever-affable Bruce hugged his teammates, congratulated them on their successful ascent, before turning away to carry on climbing upwards. Woodhall and O'Dowd pleaded with him to come back down with them, but he refused. Unable to convince Bruce to come back to the South Col, Woodhall and O'Dowd carried on down, telling Bruce that they'd wait for him back at camp. Although by now he must have been extremely tired, he'd already been climbing for over 12 hours, Bruce Herrod pushed on. He was the last man on Everest that year, a lone, solitary speck, toiling onwards and upwards towards the icy summit, a summit which must have seemed so very, very close. Sue Thompson, back in London, had heard the news of the successful summit bid, but was disappointed not to hear Bruce's name. She'd assumed that for whatever reason Bruce hadn't been able to get to the top and he'd come back down with the others. She managed to get a call through to base camp just after noon London time, which made it around 5:30 in the afternoon in Nepal. She heard the news. Bruce had just radioed base camp to tell them that he was standing on the summit of Everest. Base camp radio patched her through, and Sue and Bruce were able to speak to one another. Bruce was, of course, jubilant. He told her about the view that he was seeing and the mementos that he'd placed on the summit. But for Sue, it was a mix of apprehension and fear. All she could think of was how late it was and how she had to try to get Bruce to start back down immediately. Bruce, seemingly at ease at being so late on the summit, seemed keen to keep on chatting, but Sue insisted that he start down straight away. Getting him back down safely was all she could think about. Undaunted, Bruce remained in high spirits. He said, "Don't worry, I've got too much to look forwards to," and he ended his radio call with a happy, This is the top of the world, signing off. He was never heard from again. His teammates waited in vain at the South Col for hours, but there was no sign of him. Cathy O'Dowd and Pemba Sherpa descended to base camp, whilst Ian Woodhall, by now himself in pretty poor physical shape, stayed for another 24 hours on the South Col, peering intently into the whirling snow for any sign of Bruce, until his remaining oxygen gave out and he too was forced down to base camp. What became of Bruce Herrod was a mystery. He must have perished during his descent, that much was clear, but had he fallen, or had he succumbed to the effects of hypothermia and oxygen deprivation high on the summit of Everest? Had he become lost in the darkness and somehow strayed off the ridge in the night? Would he ever be found? Would anyone ever know what had happened to him? For Sue Thompson, the uncertainty must have been mental agony. Then, almost a year after Bruce had last been seen, came the news that his body had been found high up on the mountain. The first summit team of 1997 had found Bruce on the rock face of the Hillary Step. It seemed that as he was climbing down the rock face, he'd become tangled in the fixed ropes. He'd fallen backwards and hit his head. It's most likely that he was rendered unconscious by the blow, and he basically just never woke up. Climber Pete Athens retrieved Bruce's personal effects, as incredibly Bruce's pack was still there with all his gear, including his camera, still inside. Pete Athens then cut the rope holding the body, and Bruce's remains fell down onto the giant Kangshung face and quickly slid out of view. Eventually, Bruce's film made it all the way back to Sue Thompson in London, who got the film developed. On it, there were just 2 shots, both identical. 2 self-portraits of Bruce on the summit. He must have been so exhausted on his way up that even stopping to take other photographs must have just been too much of an effort. So, why did Bruce keep climbing when he knew that it was dangerous to keep going? Why did a man who was no wild risk-taker and planned his climbs with an almost tedious attention to detail, why did he keep going when the only logical choice was to turn back? Sue Thompson believes that Bruce had simply set his heart on climbing the mountain, and that was that. And for those that say, he was a fool, he should have just turned around, he should have just listened to common sense, you got to try, I suppose, to put yourself in Bruce's place for a moment. If you think about the time and the effort that Bruce had invested into getting where he stood right there and then on the South Summit, the planning and the organisation, the money that had been spent, the long trek to base camp, the repeated climbs to the South Col, weeks spent at high altitude, the numbing cold that you've endured, the lack of oxygen, the sleepless nights. To give up after all that, when that summit, it's right there in front of you. Well, I know for me, it would take more willpower to turn around than it would to just keep going on for that little bit further, knowing that you can make it, and just telling yourself that you just go, I'm just going to be a little bit late, that's all. I'll be extra careful on the way down. It must be so easy to kid yourself that everything's going to turn out all right. Bruce's self-portrait seems to me to be one of those photographs that definitely evokes some mixed emotions. On one hand, you see the realisation of a lifelong ambition, the joy and the delight which comes from pushing oneself to the limits and succeeding. Just look at his face. The guy is totally stoked. On the other hand, it's a tragic, haunting photograph, knowing that shortly after it was taken, Bruce would lose his life, and he would become the final victim of Everest's deadly 1996 climbing season.